Very good afternoon.
Recording has
Respected
started.
Ambassador Noji Suri, Chair for today's event, Professor Gijesh Pant, Dr. Pradhan from Manohar Parikh Institute for Defense Studies Analysis, and my colleague here at ICWA, Dr. Deepika Saraswat. Welcome you at ICWA. Before I move further, our DG Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh has conveyed her regards and thanks to you all for participating in this important webinar. She wanted to be here in the program, but because of some pressing engagement, she could not make it, and she might join at some later stage. As we know, the Gulf region, along with the whole of West Asia and North Africa, is passing through a tumult. There is an unprecedented level of strategic shift in the internal politics of Gulf Cooperation Council countries. The inter-GCC conflict was evident in severing diplomatic ties between Qatar on one hand and Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, along with Egypt on the other side in 2017. The divide is further manifested in the ongoing war in Yemen and within the OPEC on the issue of oil price and production. Along with this diplomatic tension and political conflict in recent months, some sign of reconciliation have also emerged as the blockade against Qatar has been removed and many bilateral visits have taken place among the GCC countries. Similarly, a series of direct negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia has taken place in the recent month, but it will be too early to make any forecast about the outcome of these negotiations. To examine these complexities of the current polity of the Gulf region, the ICWA has organized this webinar. Once again, I am thankful to all panelists for agreeing to take part in this webinar, particularly to Ambassador Suri, who just has returned from Dubai Expo. I hand over this to Ambassador Suri to chair the session, chair and moderate today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui, for inviting me to chair this exceptional panel and also for choosing such an interesting topic. You've mentioned reading the fault lines in the Gulf region. So I think the first question is, what are the major fault lines? Are we looking at the real fault lines, or are we looking at simply the symptoms or manifestations of those fault lines? And while we focus our attention on the fault lines, should we also look at some of the emerging trends that are appearing before our eyes? But let me just look at, from my perspective, the 4 or 5 principal fault lines and some of their symptoms. The first, which has been around for quite a while, but particularly exacerbated since the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, is the Shia-Sunni divide. This really stems from Iran's oversized role in the Gulf and the fears that the Saudis and the others have articulated about a Shia crescent that would extend from potentially from Bahrain all the way to Lebanon. It's divided the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also in the strident opposition that both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi expressed over the nuclear deal, or the JCPOA. The Emiratis were very blunt and forthright in critiquing the Obama administration and saying, look, you focused on the nuclear deal, but you forgot about Iran's missile ambitions and the fact that those can directly target our cities. You forgot about Iran's meddling in the affairs of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and everywhere else, and Bahrain, and in fact, even in parts of Saudi Arabia itself. And you forgot to bring on the table regional players like UAE and Saudi Arabia, who have a deep vested interest in what goes on. So I think they had some fairly strong reasons for not liking the P5+1 formulation and the results that came out of it. And curiously, there was almost a complete congruence in some ways between their position and the Israeli position. I was once at an event in Riyadh, and the words that I was hearing in Riyadh were almost straight out of Israeli lips. It was quite stunning to see how their positions had for some time converged around Iran. because of that divide, the Shia-Sunni divide, what we see in Yemen today as a seemingly intractable conflict with the Iranian support to the Houthis, or what we've just seen last 3 days, the spat with Lebanon, with the Saudis and the Emiratis, and now even the Kuwaitis, quite surprisingly, deciding to pull out their diplomats out of Lebanon and expelling the Lebanese ambassador, is really concern over the outsized influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the way the minister articulated the Saudi role in Yemen, of course, caused a fair bit of heartburn. But again, the key point being, these are symptoms of the larger malaise. The other divide, which I had an opportunity to see, the other fault line that I had an opportunity to see fairly close up, is the debate over the role of political Islam in the region, particularly after the short-lived Arab Spring. I was ambassador to Egypt when the first Muslim Brotherhood government was elected. I, in fact, presented my credentials to Mohamed Morsi. I accompanied him on his only state visit to India. And I was also present at the protests that led to his downfall, in July 2013, in barely a year after he had come to power. We saw the role of Turkey and Qatar in propping up the Muslim Brotherhood government, the Morsi government. And we saw the role of Saudi Arabia and UAE in bringing it down. Following the coup, many of the Muslim Brotherhood cadres who had survived the crackdown in Egypt moved to Doha or to Istanbul. And so this has created a legitimate debate about the role of an Islamist group like the Muslim Brotherhood, which has very deep roots in political Islam or in Islamic thought itself. Should they be running a country? The Qataris certainly thought, yes, they've won the elections fair and square, and so they are the new entities in town, as happened in Tunisia, and so let's back them. The Saudis and the Emiratis and others saw them as an existential threat. They thought that this political Islam is the starting point of a very slippery slope into the unknown. This is, in their mind, there was, a natural extension from Muslim Brotherhood as an Islamist political group and the political party that fronted it, to militancy and terrorism. You may agree or disagree with this perception, but the fact that this was a very strong perception, remains a very strong perception, meant that UAE and then Saudi Arabia and to an extent Bahrain chose to put themselves as the defenders of the new sort of notion of religious tolerance, where a stand had to be taken against Islamist groups, and not only against Islamist groups, but against countries like Turkey and Qatar, which were seen as favorably disposed. And I think in this, it's important to look at two manifestations. One is the speed with which the UAE itself moved to establish a Ministry of Tolerance, put a senior royal family member as the Minister for Tolerance, do some very public things like giving 13 acres of land for a Hindu temple in Abu Dhabi, announcing that they would build the House of Abraham family, where you would have a synagogue, a temple, and a mosque in the same complex. And of course, the Abraham Accords themselves, with the very rapidly advancing rapprochement with Israel after the establishment of diplomatic relations. So you have a fault line where the Emiratis are leading the way towards what they want to project as a more progressive, more tolerant religious opposition. And in that, the Qataris in particular are accused with some legitimacy, that they use Al Jazeera's Arabic channel to promote some fairly radical thoughts. They give a platform to people like Yusuf al-Qaradawi. They have created outlets like the New Arab, which take up some of those causes, including making sure that if anything related to the Muslim community happens in India, it must be magnified in Al Jazeera Arabic or in the New Arab or in their other funded outlets. So in India, in a sense, is also at the receiving end of some of this. We saw this manifest in the quartet of UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt boycotting Qatar, and then the sort of reconciliation that happened after the Al Ula agreement this year. I think some of the differences have been papered over on the surface, but the fault lines remain. And it's going to be interesting to see as we go forward how things move with respect to Afghanistan as a case in point, where Qatar hosted the Taliban for several years. The Doha Accords were born in Qatar. And to the extent that they have some influence over the Taliban, as does Turkey, would they be prepared to use that influence to bring the Taliban towards a more inclusive kind of an agenda? You can't ignore the fact that Abdul Ghani, former president of Afghanistan, is now in Abu Dhabi. So would he have the ear of the leadership to make his case on what's going on? Again, things that we need to keep an eye on. The third fault line then is the old issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the issue of legitimate Palestinian rights. This is a fault line that used to be fairly strongly present and extending into the Gulf. But the Abraham Accords of last year have really shifted the grounds on this. Two of the Gulf countries, Abu Dhabi and Bahrain, have, of course, established diplomatic ties with Tel Aviv. Oman and Qatar have varying degrees of an informal relationship, and Riyadh may not be that far behind if there is some movement on the Palestinian issue. Also worth keeping in mind that all of these countries have their own favorites amongst the Palestinian groups. So the Hamas leader Khalid al-Mashal is still based in Doha. The former security chief Mohammed Dahlan is in Abu Dhabi. There are others who are in Riyadh. And so as the jockeying begins for a post-Mahmoud Abbas leadership, I think you might see these countries push for various candidates of their own. I often get asked the question that what does this mean? What do the Abraham Accords mean for the two-state solution? I've heard fairly senior people say that it's great to keep the idea alive, and India continues to strongly support it in its official statements. But with every passing year, the so-called facts on the ground that the Jewish settlements are creating in the West Bank mean that a viable Palestinian state becomes a more and more remote possibility. And so that's a fault line that's going to continue to be around for a while, unless something dramatic happens with a new Palestinian leadership and so on. I don't see the Israelis relenting at all in terms of their hardline positions. If anything, the Israeli mainstream has shifted further to the right. And then there's a fourth emerging fault line, I would say, that needs careful attention. And this is shifting it from the religious and the political to the economic. Dr. Siddiqui mentioned about the spat between Saudi Arabia and UAE publicly on OPEC, and with UAE arguing quite vigorously that its quotas need to be expanded. But there is also the ongoing rivalry that we are seeing with the Saudis almost mandating that if you want to do business in Saudi Arabia, you better have your headquarters in Saudi Arabia and not in Dubai. I mean, Dubai is not specified, but that's the fact is that right now, pretty much every company worth its salt has its Middle East and North Africa headquarters in Dubai. And it is central to the prosperity of that place. When the Saudis decided quite unilaterally to put a 15% tariff on products that did not meet a 25% value addition norm, 25% of labor, again, it's hit the Emiratis pretty hard. And when I was in Dubai last week, I picked this up both in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi from senior people that this is a major concern and it is not going anywhere. But if the Saudis and the Emiratis are in such discord with each other on this issue, then what does it mean for GCC itself? And what does it mean for India's FTA talks with GCC? And I was joking at one of the events that maybe the GCC first needs an FTA within itself before it starts talking to India to get some of their own thoughts together. So, to me, these are, say, four of the big fault lines that are around. But as I said, while we look at the fault lines, let's also look at the emerging trends, the new trends. And the one of particular interest to us is the sort of the emergence or the emerging West Asia Quad. The fact that the foreign ministers of India, Israel, UAE, and the US met. And the Israeli foreign minister announced that a physical meeting may be taking place fairly soon, potentially on the sidelines of the Dubai Expo. I don't know whether he was ahead of the curve, but it certainly holds out possibilities and presents challenges in terms of India's own relationships in the Gulf. I think one thing that we have demonstrated fairly solidly over the years is our capacity to engage with multiple partners who may be otherwise at war with each other. So we haven't allowed our relationship with UAE come in the way of our ties with Iran. And so going forward, I think we will see that these challenges maybe become a bit sharper, but also the opportunities of trying to combine Emirati capital and Israeli technology with Indian scale and markets presents a fascinating possibility in key areas. The idea of a potential trade corridor, which extends from Mumbai to Jebel Ali and takes a train to Haifa and then on to Piraeus in Greece, could potentially cut down shipping times by 40%. And presents, again, interesting opportunities, alternatives to the Suez Canal, alternatives to some of the BRI stuff that's happening. So again, I think there are interesting trends emerging. And so I think when we discuss fault lines, we should also look at the opportunities and trends that are emerging. And I'll hand this back to you, Dr. Siddiqui.
Thank you very much for your insightful remarks. And no doubt you have raised some very pertinent questions ranging from political Islam to Saudi-US spat, and then about how things are moving, then reconciliation, then the Qatar rule in Afghanistan, all these things. Now, to take this discussion further, since you have to, I think you have already told that you have to leave for some emergency medical appointment. To take the discussion further, I would like to invite our colleague at ICWA, Dr. Deepika, to present her remarks on India's balancing act amid the turmoil in the region and India's stake. You have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. After Ambassador Suri has laid out the various fault lines in the region, my job is rather limited, which is to look at how India is navigating these fault lines. Something that Ambassador Suri also highlighted, that how over the years, Arab-Israeli conflict is no longer, it no longer has the structuring power over the regional politics that it had, say, a decade ago. Gulf state, the Gulf region has become the new center of geopolitical, the new geopolitical center of gravity. It started with the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, that weakened Iraq and then the Arab uprisings a decade later, which weakened another traditional core of the Arab world, which is Egypt. So what we've seen over the last decade or so, that the Gulf states, led by Saudi Arabia and UAE, they have risen to play a role in taking on the non-Arab challenges of Iran and Turkey, and they are playing a increasing role in shaping the region, the whole wider region of West Asia and North Africa. Another trend that I must allude to as a context is the declining American commitment to the region, which has further pushed the regional players and also created space for a new set of actors, extra-regional players, basically India and China, which have primarily, played an economic role, but they're increasingly taking new commitments and sort of reassessing their role in the region. And I must say that this is also because these Gulf states, which are pursuing a policy of hedging against their American relations, they have also welcomed this new set of actors. They've been trying to diversify their relations with rising powers of Asia. So it is in this context that India has sort of revamped its approach to the region, and we've seen that that this region, which has been very central to India's energy security, Qatar being the largest provider of LNG, providing about 60% of country's needs, and Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and UAE being primary suppliers of oil. So in addition to this concern with energy security and maritime security, these concerns have actually sort of paved the way for deeper defense partnership and cooperation between India and the Gulf states. So in 2019, when there were these series of incidents in the Strait of Hormuz, we saw that India, instead of joining the US-led coalition on the coalition on freedom of navigation, sent its two vessels which were accompanying Indian merchant vessels in and out of Strait of Hormuz and Gulf of Oman. And though there was a cooperation with the United States, which has an enduring presence in the region, on refueling India's ships, so we've seen that India is developing its own, approach to how to secure its energy security and maritime security amidst this changing role of the United States. And this has happened just over a span of, let's say, 5-6 years, when the government of Prime Minister Modi has, sort of gave new emphasis on developing ties with Gulf states. So in 2018, when Prime Minister Modi visited Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there was much emphasis on creating institutional mechanisms for strengthening defense ties and bilateral cooperation in counterterrorism as well. This year, we saw there were naval drills with both Saudi Arabia and UAE in August, just 2 months ago. So basically, the point that I should make, I should try and make clearly that New Delhi can no longer be charged with having a transactional approach to the region. India, as it's playing a leading role in Asia, its Link West policy has sort of redefined India's traditional balanced approach to the region, where India is engaging with all sets of regional actors and seeking to strengthen ties both at multilateral level and at bilateral level. So the most recently a new multilateral engagement that has emerged is the Quad that Ambassador Suri referred to, and this is coming in the wake of the changes, the new dynamic that has emerged in the Gulf after the normalization of ties between the UAE and Israel. So during EM Shankar's visit to Israel, this quad meeting of foreign ministers of UAE, Israel, and the UAE for establishing an international forum on coordinating strategy on economic cooperation and transport, and also maritime security, it indicates a new trend where India is working with set of US allies in the region, and but I here it's important to have a caveat that it's this talk about a new geostrategic alliance, much like the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, may be premature. It has to be seen in the context of how India has pursued this balanced diplomacy, where as there is a focus on strengthening ties with the Gulf states, but the similar kind of cooperation can be seen on more neutral states in the Gulf, such as Oman, and those who are seen on the other side of the Persian Gulf, that is Iran. Like in December 2019, when EM Jaishankar visited Iran, it was followed by a trilateral meeting of foreign ministers of Oman and Iran in Muscat. And this is, we have to understand that both Iran, Oman, and India are party to the Ashgabat Agreement, which is about facilitating connectivity between the Eurasia and the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. So I think India, as it strengthens its partnership with Gulf states, it has to be seen in context of India's traditional policy of balanced diplomacy. Coming to a more recent issue that is Afghanistan, the developments in Afghanistan. I think it's fair to say that during the 1990s, the changes that happened in Afghanistan sort of led Iran and India to, see their bilateral relations in more strategic terms. So similarly, the recent developments that with the quick takeover of Taliban and unraveling of Kabul government, we've seen that there is a close coordination between Tehran and New Delhi. And when EAM Jaishankar became the first foreign dignitary to be received by President Raisi after his election, he welcomed New Delhi's role in terms of stabilizing the region, especially in Afghanistan. So on Afghanistan, we've seen that there has been close coordination with Saudi Arabia and UAE as well. When Saudi foreign minister visited India only last month, I think Afghanistan was one key item on the agenda, and it's totally understandable given that both Saudi Arabia, UAE, and also India, they share concern about possible revival of Al Qaeda or other radical extremist organization on Afghan soil. So, in this sense, given these Gulf states and India have a concern about spread of radicalism in the region, so there is convergence, and it's very obvious that there would be, cooperation on this particular subject. So I'll just rest my conclusions here that India, which has always pursued a balanced diplomacy of where it has stayed neutral and steered clear of regions' conflicts, is going to be strengthening relations with both the sides. I mean, as the region gains more profile in India's, India's foreign policy in the neighborhood, it's going to be pursuing a policy of engaging with all sides. Thank you.
I think Dr. Deepika, you rightly pointed out the growing role of non-Arab countries like Turkey, Iran, and Israel in the region. Then you talked about the declining US commitment in the region, then diversifying the relationship between India's role and how India is going to revamp its entire approach towards the region. Then also you talked about how India shares some kind of concern with UAE and Saudi Arabia when it comes to Afghanistan and takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban. India has many concerns, and I think India, along with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, could play a very important role. These are the major points that to raise. I think these things might come up during the question and answer session. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Prasad, who is Associate Fellow at Mohan Parekh Institute for Defense Study Analysis. He will speak on Saudi-Iran rivalry in the remote context and the present context, what is happening in the last 1 decade. Over to you, Dr. Pradhan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siddiqui, and a very good afternoon to all of you. My thanks also to the ICWA for organizing this webinar and inviting me to share my thoughts on this important subject, that is on the Iran-Saudi relationship. As you all know, for decades, there is an uneasy relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two most important regional players in the Gulf and the West Asian region. And this has impacted the regional geopolitics and security to a large extent. There are ideological differences, there are political differences, there is competition over regional leadership, and both the countries have differing perceptions of regional security architecture as well. Their military strength, their economic strength, their political and ideological influence over other countries, other non-state groups, have made them play leading roles in the region. And interestingly, both have sets of friends and allies, which further strengthens their respective positions in the region. And in recent times, and even throughout the last decades, one sees the statements made by the leaders reflect a marked absence of mutual trust and confidence between these two countries. The Saudi-Iranian relationship has been strained ever since the Islamic Revolution in Iran took place in 1979. Soon after, Ayatollah Khomeini openly declared his intention of exporting his brand of Islam and support the Shias in other countries of the region to overthrow the neighboring Sunni regimes. Saudi Arabia, which has two holiest sites in Islam, Makkah and Medina on its soil, which claims to be the world leader of the Muslims, and at the same time, Iran, with a majority of the Shia population and influence over several Shia groups in the Middle East, has emerged as a natural leader of the Shias. So, in this context, the coming to power of Ayatollah Khomeini posed a challenge, both in terms of ideology as well as national interest, to the Arab countries in the Gulf, particularly to Saudi Arabia, whose claims to be the leader of the Muslim world was challenged by a new revolutionary Iranian regime. And there have been subsequent developments in the region. There have been several turmoil. The region has always been in turmoil, be it Iran-Iraq war, Gulf war, and then comes the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, the emergence of the Arab protests since starting from December 2010, further widened the divide between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which further deteriorated the already strained relationship. Iran has shown keen interest in the developments taking place in the Arab streets, while Saudi Arabia cautioned Iran not to interfere in affairs of the Arab countries. As the protests continue to spread from one country to another, the interests and stakes of both these countries continue to grow at the same time. The Al-Saud regime was concerned about their regime security as well as protecting its national interest in the midst of the unpredictable changes that was taking place in the Arab world at that point of time. During the initial days of protests, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, and Yemen, Iran supported the protesters in the Arab world. The leaders of these countries were, on the other hand, friendly towards Saudi Arabia. Thus, the Iranian support for the protesters in the Arab street hit Saudi Arabia to a large extent, which again warned Iran not to intervene in the affairs of the Arab politics. Saudi Arabia was also worried that Iran would instigate the Shias in other countries and to gain advantage of the situation that was unfolding, which was full of uncertainty. And in subsequent years, we have seen that the involvement of these two countries in all the conflict zones, be it in Yemen, in Syria, in Egypt, which has led the commentators to say that this is a proxy war, and which is going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia in different conflict zones. And neither of these countries have shown any serious intention to engage in negotiation to resolve these issues. So the conflict zones in the region have been the theater of proxy conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the situation as it continues today, situation in Yemen particularly, is worsening day by day. The Saudi-Iran relationship hit a rock bottom in 2016 in the aftermath of the execution of Saudi Shia cleric Nimr al-Nimr by the Saudi government. Nimr al-Nimr was a vocal critique of the Saudi government during the days of street protests in 2011. It was alleged that Nimr instigated anti-government protests in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, which is where a majority of the Shia population live. Iran condemned the execution of Nimr. Saudi Arabia and along with other GCC countries called it a blatant interference in kingdom's affairs. Soon after that, the Saudi embassy in Tehran and the Saudi consulate in northeastern city of Mashhad were ransacked by the protesters. Saudi Arabia got infuriated with the attacks on its embassy and the consulate, and it announced to cut off diplomatic ties with Iran. One also sees the emergence and intensification of sectarian politics that Ambassador Suri was referring to during his presentation. The intensity of the involvement of these two countries has prompted suspicion that Iran is trying to build a Shia crescent, including countries like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and that Saudi Arabia is leading a Sunni axis to confront the Iranian influence in the region. So the deep sectarian divide in the regional politics in West Asia, with the involvement of Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other, has not only further widened the difference between these two countries, but it has also created an instability and insecurity in the region as a whole. The Iranian nuclear issue is another important issue, which has remained a bone of contention between the two. Though Saudi Arabia initially adopted a reconciliatory approach towards the Iranian nuclear deal in 2015, it subsequently raised the issue of Iranian intervention in the region, like allegedly funding terrorist organizations and other non-state actors whose activities are destabilizing the whole region. Saudi Arabia held that signing of the JCPOA didn't destroy completely the Iranian capabilities to make a nuclear weapon. Rather, it has only delayed the process. Therefore, Riyadh has made constant efforts to convince the US about the repercussions of the JCPOA. Riyadh welcomed the President Trump's decision to withdraw from JCPOA 2018, but the issue still remains a key issue of contention between the two. We have seen, as a result of growing Saudi-Iran frictions during the Arab Spring, a politics of military coalitions. There was once a proposal for joint Arab military force, which was once discussed by the Arab League. Saudi Arabia was clearly a supporter of that. We have seen another committees such as Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Russia. The objective of the committee was to collect and process information in order to fight the ISIS. But this informal alliance was a counterweight to Saudi-dominated bloc, which was backed by the US. Then there is an effort to bring the GCC countries as well as the Egypt and Jordan, which is known as Middle East Strategic Alliance, MESA, with the backing of the US. Secretary Pompeo, while emphasizing the objectives and issues before the MESA, stated that stopping Iran's maligning activities in the region was a key objective of the MESA. So that, and again, there is the IMCTC, the Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition, which is a Saudi initiative. The objective is to establish some kind of strategic partnership between members of these countries. But the absence of key Shia-dominated countries like Iran, Iraq, and Syria, three crucial countries in the Muslim world, from the alliance has drawn criticism that IMCTC is as being a Sunni alliance. So Riyadh has been at the forefront of establishment of the IMCTC. This is an attempt by Saudi Arabia to institutionalize a long-term military cooperation, drawing the like-minded countries together under one umbrella. Though the stated objective is to fight terrorism like ISIS, but the formation of this alliance certainly gives a boost to Saudi Arabia and its regional allies by providing a much-needed regional security umbrella to posture themselves as a united military front. Role of US and the regional security in the Gulf particularly has been a key issue. The US is the key regional security provider in the Gulf region. It has military bases all over the region in all the Gulf monarchies. This is Iran's primary concern in the region. It feels threatened by the presence of US military. Iran strongly opposes US military presence, and instead, Iran always proposes a regional security architecture involving the countries of the region only, without any involvement of the external players. But Saudi Arabia and its allies have the suspicion that if US withdraws its military from the region, then it would lead to some kind of Iranian domination in the Gulf. But despite all the differences, there have been some initiative towards some kind of negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both the countries held talks in Baghdad in April this year. Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi was playing an important role in bringing both these countries to the negotiating table. The talks were held at an official level. Though details of the talks have not been made public, but several newspaper reports stated that the Yemen issue figured prominently in the discussions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both the countries now are under international pressure for the deteriorating security situation and humanitarian situation in Yemen, especially since President Joe Biden came to power. US has asked Saudi Arabia to stop its military offensive in Yemen. Earlier in February this year, Biden announced withdrawal of US military support to the war in Yemen. So clearly, so far as Yemen is concerned, Saudi Arabia is under pressure from the US. Besides, both these countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are facing significant security and economic challenges. The Houthis have launched drones, missile attacks into Saudi Arabia, including key vital installations such as Aramco oil facilities. The Saudi involvement in the military operations in Yemen has not achieved its intended objective of driving the Houthis out of the capital. Rather, it has been a drain on its national budget. It has been fighting a war since 2015. Riyadh would therefore want an acceptable solution to the Yemeni crisis and an honorable exit from the country as well. The Iranian economy is also suffering badly after the US has reimposed sanctions. The Biden administration is insisting on Iranian compliance with the terms of JCPOA before it can lift sanctions in Iran. So thus Iran also faces the dual pressure from US on Yemen and JCPOA as well. Though both the countries have come forward to engage in talks, as I said in the beginning, the fundamental difference between them on ideological, political, and their regional security issues are huge. They still perceive each other as a threat to their national security, despite the Iranian assurance on peaceful use of nuclear energy. Saudi Arabia doesn't seem to be convinced. Saudi Arabia believes that Iran acquiring the nuclear weapon in the region would change the regional balance of power hugely in favor of Tehran. Besides Yemen, there are the Iran and Saudi interests around counter to each other in several conflict zones like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon today. Finally, I would say that the competition for regional supremacy between the two is not likely to end soon, despite the beginning of the talks. It would be difficult indeed for them to reconcile the historical differences and long-term interest they have throughout the region. The talks that are going on at present are at a very embryonic stage. There's still a lot of talks and negotiations to come in the future. But the reconciliatory approach which has been shown by both these countries are welcome, and they may help to de-escalate the tension in short term and medium term as well. Yes, given the adversarial relationship between the two, achieving substantial progress between them would require long negotiations, and as well as mutual trust and willingness to engage in dialogue on the critical issues affecting them. I'll stop here and look forward to questions and answers. Back to you, Dr. Fazul. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradhan. Dr. Pradhan, I think you're right when you say that the existing difference between Iran and Saudi Arabia is not likely to end very soon, despite all this negotiation that is taking place in recent month. I think you talked about Yemen, you talked about security architecture, you talked about nuclear deals, and you talked about how the Islamic revolution has aggravated this difference between two major powers of the region. Then you also talked about how Iran is being accused of doing all kinds of regional intervention. So there are so many factors that are really shaping the Iran-Saudi rivalry in the region, and how the future trajectory take place, one doesn't know. But there are some good signs. Since this negotiation started, we can expect something better would come out. Now, I would like to request my esteemed Professor Gijesh Pant to present his views on what is happening in the region. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui, for giving me the opportunity to be speaking at the webinar. The theme, I recall that when I started studying West Asia, it was always mentioned that West Asia is a very conflict-prone region. And even today, you find that the theme remains that the region is conflict-prone. The issue, therefore, are there, and as it has been mentioned by the earlier speakers, range of points are there, the flash points are there. But I'm not going into detail of that because I assume that it doesn't need any kind of reiteration of that. What I propose to do this afternoon is primarily to make my assessment of how do I see the region, how do I read, as your title says, reading the fault line. And I have two observations, and to substantiate these two observations, I will give the illustrations. My first observation is that I'm talking of the next 5 years period in my mind. My first observation will be that the intra-regional conflicts are likely to be de-escalated in the coming times rather than escalated. And the assumption is that the dividend or the return which the regional players get from the conflict, their returns are declining, and the cost is going very high, which is going to pose a serious problem for their own security and survival. So therefore, the attempt will be in coming years, and I will give you the evidence, some of that which has already been spoken by the earlier speakers. The tendency is more towards moderating the conflicts. I'm not arguing that the conflicts are going to be resolved, but what I'm going to suggest is that the escalation is not likely to be there. My second observation is that I'm talking of the GCC countries, as the GCC countries are going to diversify their economic systems, moving away from oil-based or post-rentier society, they are pushing region to intra-regional competition. That is to say that intra-regional cooperation is not likely to be very high on their agenda. It is going to be more intra-regional competition. Some sense of this was given by Ambassador Suri also. And the second thing which emerges out of that is that they are going to go for extra-regional engagement. Now, this could spill over into some kind of a tension in the coming years. But again, I'm reiterating the point that I don't subscribe and I don't see, as of now, that these tensions are going to leading to the conflict situation. Now, what are the factors which I have in my mind when I say the region is going to be witnessing a process of de-escalation? One is very fairly known factor is the American reluctance to provide security, to be the security provider. The moment, my argument is that everyone who was secured in the days of American security architecture is today feeling insecure, and the fact that they are finding themselves insecure it leads to possibility that the conflicts are not going to be there. We can debate it, but that's the one proposition which I have in mind. Second is that the issue which again mentioned is about the Afghanistan, that the coming up of the Taliban taking over the Afghanistan is going to have very serious implication for the entire character of the political Islam. A mention has been made. But my formulation is slightly different. My formulation is that the political Islam from Wahhabi Shiite to Muslim Brotherhood is going to face challenge from the Taliban or extreme form of the Islam. And therefore, the kind of differences which were playing a role in defining and redefining political Islam are not going to be there. It's going to be much more sharply, a defined project where either Islam, which is engaging with the modernity, or name could be anyone, and it could be any name, or the extreme form of Islam, which is the Talibani or the militant Islam. If this binary is accepted, then I would like to argue that the conflict between Wahhabi Islam and, for that matter, the conflict between Shia and Sunni Islam is going to be moderated, is not going to play very escalating role as it played in the earlier, because the threat is going to come from the militant Islam, or for that matter, from the terrorist form of Islam. So therefore, these are the, and interestingly, what I see is that in the coming days, every country is going to, from this region, is going to interpret or define Islam in its own way. And this again, a point was made earlier, the way the Saudis are defining the Islam, or the Crown Prince is defining the Islam, or for that matter, how UAE is defining, and that is going to happen in the coming year. So therefore, these two propositions are going to be there. One is the American one, the other is the coming of the Afghanistan, and the political Islam plays an important role. I'm reiterating the point which is mentioned by earlier speakers, that the return of the Qatar in GCC is again a pointer of the fact that the countries in the region, GCC countries, are not interested in escalating their tensions. They want to de-escalate it. And that is the reason that countries like Saudi Arabia is taking a different position. If UAE also reluctantly is a different position. And they know it that that one of the reasons that if they can bring Qatar back into GCC fold, they are going to improve their relationship with the Americans as well. Especially the Saudis would like to improve the relationship with the present president of the United States. So therefore, they also would not like the Qatar to be part of extra player engagements in the region, and hence they are interested in keeping Qatar. Because again, the point is that the cost of keeping Qatar out and the burden on the region will be much higher. So therefore, they would like to bring the Qatar into the system as much as possible. So therefore, you find that this one is a very major development, which shows that the regional players are not interested in escalating the tension. Similarly, the point was made, again, I'm reiterating from the point of view of the escalation and de-escalation thesis, that you will find that Iran is going to win. All efforts are there to bring the Iran back to the table. Iranian president, the newly elected Iranian president Raisi, knows it very well. The economy is very, very bad shape. And the radical slogans are not going to make the Iranian youth on the street to keep quiet. And therefore, they are very keen to work out some kind of engagement which helps them to get the benefit of their entire economic resources, coming out of the boycotts. All these processes they are engaged with, and it is in this context that you find that the mention which Pradhan mentioned about the meeting which took place in Baghdad, where Iran showed keen interest to build ties or build relations with the Arab countries, because that is one way by which possibly the coming back of Iran into mainstream could be possible. Then the other conflict again. This is again a point which Khan mentioned, that the Yemen conflict has again proved the high cost. It has become so high cost with totally uncertain returns. So that again makes it necessary for them, for both the players, the Saudis and Iranians, to work out some kind of a compromise, to work out some kind of a solution which can make some sustainable, equilibrium in Yemen. So this again has to be seen in terms of burden this 6 years old war has put on both Iran as well as Saudi Arabia. And the one point which is not mentioned so far is that how the looking at the cost of the war in Syria, the Arab countries are now keen to have some kind of rapprochement with Syria. And recently we have come across where especially 2018 onward, the countries are trying to build ties with the regime in Syria. And already UAE and Bahrain possibly are looking for reopening of the embassies there. So there are big movements which are going on the front again to realize that the high cost of Syrian, civil conflicts is not sustainable to any of the players. All the stakeholders are almost tired and fatigued of this prolonged conflict in Syria. And in fact, some of the countries are looking for the new opportunities coming in Syria in terms of construction, etc. And we know about how UAE is very keen to make an investment there, how the Qatar is interested. I mean, a number of the players are looking for some kind of a business in the reconstruction process. And last but not least, towards moderating tendencies, is mention made about the Abraham Accord. Now, this again is very interesting development to be seen, that how the players are realizing that the bringing of Israel will moderate the temperatures of the region, rather than earlier period that it will lead to some kind of heating up of the tension there. And therefore, this is a very significant milestone to say that the de-escalation process is again on the region. The point which is not covered so far, I would like to now develop here, and that is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, my second observation is that with the diversification process, the possibility of tensions is going to go up in the region. And why I am saying so? For the simple reason that if we look at the entire so-called vision, projected by all these players, you will very clearly see what is happening there is that all the regimes are trying to promote a state-led economic diversification. It is not market-driven. It is basically a state-led economic diversification, and they are doing so largely because they feel, in their understanding, that is the way by which the regime can obtain security and stability. And therefore, you'll find that the big companies which are coming up in this region are essentially other state-owned companies. They are engaged into big construction projects and in the big infrastructure projects, and they are supported. If they are not directly involved, if the state is not directly involved, the state is supporting them. You see, so basically, you will find that the entire economic reform process, which is being talked about in the region, is state-driven. So that's one. Why am I underlining this point? If it is a state-driven process, then it can have its own political ramification, and that is where it becomes, the economic reform becomes slightly vulnerable to the politics of the region. The second point, which is again you will notice there, that in the earlier days we used to say that the Gulf countries have the same natural resource endowment. So these economies are basically a competitive economies. So if they are a competitive economies, then there can't be much trade between these countries because there is no complementarity at all. You see, it was expected that if the diversification process will begin, maybe that new complementarity will be talked about, will be conceived, will be argued. But if you look at today, the bulk of the GCC diversification projects in all the countries is around certain very common sectors like high tech, knowledge, tourism, which are again are not. I mean, in other words, what is happening there, rather than creating complementarities, there is a kind of a new competitive economies are emerging in the region. Now, if the countries are promoting tourism, the tourism is going to be much more in terms of the global tourism, which is going to play important role there, and therefore you find that the entire economic remakeup of the region is not going to promote any kind of intra-regional cooperation. There's no ground for that intra-regional cooperation. Rather, it is going to be intra-regional competition. And this point again is mentioned earlier, and I will also elaborate further between the kind of tension which we are witnessing between Saudi Arabia and UAE. So post-rentier competition is going to be the new phase, which is going to be interesting development to be seen in the coming year. Now, as we know that Dubai model is very popular model, and everybody in Saudi Arabia looks at Dubai as a success story. And Dubai has been, or UAE has been more successful in terms of attracting foreign capital and emerging as a kind of a regional hub for software companies and service-oriented companies. And therefore, and Saudis especially after the Crown Prince taking over the running of the country in a sense, the entire project is basically again to restructure the economy around the same kind of processes which Dubai has done it. Of course, the difference is of the scales and the volumes. Now, it was found that Saudis discovered that despite their best efforts, they have not been able to attract that kind of a volume of foreign investment or the big companies as Dubai has been able to do that, you see. And therefore, they have recently passed this law, which Ambassador was mentioning, that they will not accept import from the region unless until it is 25% of that is contributed by the local workforce, you see. Now, I don't have to remind you or to tell you that the workforce in these countries is largely coming from the outside. You see, they are not the domestic, they are not the regional, workforce. And if that is so, the countries which are largely dependent on the expatriates for the production of the product will be disqualified, you see. And therefore, you'll find that it's without mentioning, it's very clearly going to have impact on Saudi UAE trade. And according to one estimate, that already 30% of Saudi's import from UAE has declined as a result of this new policy taken by Saudi Arabia. So this is similarly, the Saudi Arabians are asking that the big companies should relocate their headquarters from Dubai to Saudi Arabia. Now, this again is going to have a kind of a heartburning between UAE and Saudi Arabia as they are going to, as they proceed further on the diversification process. Another area which I would like to draw your attention is that about the competitive politics is a new green area that's called green competition, I will call. That's both the Gulf, overall the Gulf countries are making huge investment on green projects and eco-friendly projects. But the two countries which are again competing here in a very big way is again Saudi Arabia and UAE in terms of leadership. Who is going to take leadership? If Saudi Arabia, if the UAE is called a kind of regional dialogue on climate action summit in last April, it was immediately followed by a big mega project by Saudi Arabia. Now we are told that UAE is very very keen to host a 28th international conference on climate change. Is bidding for it. So you find that this kind of a competition is going to emerge in the region, as they are going to engage their or promote their the diversification process, which is not embedded into the manufacturing within the country. It is basically externally, it is totally dependent upon the impetus or I should say acceleration, which is coming from the outside. And that's the reason that you will find that these countries suffer very badly, though they could sustain because of the oil this time to some extent, but they suffer badly because when the tourism collapsed because of the coronavirus, and therefore their economy suffered a big loss. You see. So they become vulnerable as well. But the fact remains that these countries are going going in a very big way on a green project at globally, essentially with the purpose of playing a role of the leadership role in the. And other area, other point which I mentioned earlier, that how the diversification is taking to extra regional engagement, and I will not go into detail except mentioning that how the UAE, Israel, USA, India, which is being talked about, is a case of a new economic complementarities, or I will say new techno-economic complementarities, and many such possibilities are going to emerge. We find a similar kind of engagement coming on the Red Sea area, where the Saudis' Red Sea strategic project is coming in a very big way, and they want to create a new kind of outlet of their energy and a new kind of development model. It's very interesting that that one part of Saudi Arabia was basically based on extractive industry, that is the hydrocarbon-based industry. Now, on the eastern coast, the entire structure which they are building is on artificial intelligence. Now, two different opposite kind of a model of economic development. Interest, significantly and possibly, adds difficulty to Saudis. That in either case, the possibility of their own citizen getting jobs is very minimal. Why I am saying so? Because if you look at the hydrocarbon sector by definition is a capital intensive, not labor intensive. So therefore, it doesn't create big job even if you are an largest exporter of the hydrocarbon in the international market. You do not the technology of the hydrocarbon does not create as many jobs as the volume of the petroleum or natural gas would like to indicate. It can be argued that if they move to renewable energy, possibly the jobs can be created, and which they are moving to renewable energy. But when they come to the other side, the city like Neom City, which is going to be artificially intelligence-based city, etc. Now, this artificial intelligence system again is very super high-tech kind of city which they are talking of, and there you need again human resource support, which is highly skilled. Again, the local population of Saudi Arabia does not provide that kind of high skill, and it is again a very interesting development to notice that it is precisely realizing that the local human resource is not able to meet the kind of economic profile these countries are building to meet the future development of the country. It needs a very kind of high skilled manpower, and if they are not getting the high skilled manpower, what they are creating, like in case of UAE, it has been reported that they are relaxing the rules for the expatriates, the professional expatriate, to be settled in a short period. Citizenship are being given, and the idea basically is to draw talent, to draw expertise, to create some kind of global series in this. So what I'm trying to argue here is that the entire West Asia, or the architecture which emerging in the region at the moment, is not is certainly has some kind of a challenges emerging there, but is a period which we are going to witness, is a period not of very high conflict situations. All players will be making their effort best that the conflicts are not escalated. Attempts are being made to de-escalate the conflict as much as possible. And if that assumption of mine is correct, and if that works it out, I see huge possibility for India to play a role. I'll not elaborate on it at the moment, but simply make this point that the India faces a crisis in the region where when the lines are drawn between one country and other country, India has to make a choice. But if the lines are not drawn, as if the situation is going to come where the possibility of lines are not going to be drawn as sharply as they were driven sharply earlier during, say, American presence in the region. In the post-American presence in the region, there is a possibility that these lines may not sharply be drawn, and that will provide India a new space to play a role, both in terms of promoting human resources, which I just talked about, in terms of developing the entrepreneurship, which the region needs very desperately, and also in creating a new kind of institutional arrangement which these countries need to move as they move from oil-based to the non-oil-based economies. I'm talking in terms of the startup, the mentoring of the startup, etc., which is a very huge possibility which one can find in this region. Well, I think it's time I'll stop here. If there are questions, one is welcome to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So I think, sir, you have talked about this. This is the economic drive that will reshape the future politics in the Gulf region. You have talked about this is the economic cost that might compel the states to go for a kind of reconciliation process, and that I think we have started expecting that. Now we have come to the end of this presentation. So I would begin this question with one simple question to you. So you talked about this now. This de-escalation is the future, but what we have been observing in the region for the last 1.5 years, 2 years, but the state might think in terms of economy. The state might think that this war has been really costing a lot. But the unfortunate part is that the entire fight is being waged by the non-state actors. And every day we have been fighting new political actors entering the war. The latest example being Kuwait. In the last 10 years, Kuwait has maintained almost a kind of neutrality very much similar to Oman. But for the first time, it has sided with Saudi Arabia. It has sided with Bahrain to call back its ambassador from Lebanon. On the other hand, we can see in Yemen, despite, I think for the last 6 years, we have seen many set of negotiation engagement, but nothing has come out. Even between Iran and Saudi Arabia, on the one side, we have been seeing negotiation, but the other side, we have been hearing a lot about criticism and condemnation, and both sides started blaming each other. But given the circumstances, when the entire political trajectory is in the control of non-state actors, then what role state has to play? And how we can see this future 2 years, 3 years, there would be a de-escalation, that while the reality is that only escalation we have been witnessing that. So,
you see, I said in the opening of my statement that I do recognize that the region is conflict prone. So conflicts are going to be there, and all these conflicts you mentioned there, most of them are something which is over a period of Yemen is 5-6 year old project. Iran, Saudis, goes back to the Iranian revolution, and those things are not going to be resolved. You say, but my main argument was that why at one given point of time these conflicts get escalated or made to get escalated by the ruling government or the state for certain gain or for certain purpose. Now, Iran knows it. I mean, nobody's saying that Iran is going to talk Iran and Saudi relations are going to be, very friendly in the immediate future. But the fact is that they, after so many years, now today they are realizing that, it's time that we should talk about it, explore the possibility of seeing whether it can be de-escalated or not. And the Saudis, which felt possibly that they at any point of time, if there is a crisis, Americans are there to help them. Now they realize that no, the cost is going to be very high if they escalate crisis with conflict with Iran. So my point is that I'm not disputing the region doesn't have conflict. The conflict vulnerabilities are always there, and you will also find that non-state are going to play their role. I mean, Arab uprising has very clearly shown, and the examples from Tunisia and other places very clearly shown that the street is going to be there. And therefore, I was trying to argue that while the problem with the government and with these GCC countries are that even their economic reform or economic future which they are defining is again based on the state, totally dependent on the state, and therefore, and it is driven largely for the purpose of state, security or the regime security, regime stability. That so in this process, to make the regime stable and secure. Now they have different strategies. Now Saudis are doing one strategy, the UAE is having its own strategy, and Kuwaitis have a problem. I do reply because the economic and political facet of the society is not identical as in case of Saudi Arabia and UAE. But the point I'm trying to draw your attention here is that the new economic processes, as though they are meant to regime security, regime stability, have a pathway to engage the civil society or the social forces, and that possibly will create a situation. When I don't want to go into detail, but what I would like to argue that while it is true that top-down approach is not a desirable approach, but in the case of Gulf countries, it is too early to say that there's going to be bottom approach as well, because the bottom is not so fertile in terms of protest or in terms of or I will say the bottom is fairly satisfied with the kind of economic benefits which the state is going to pass it on to them. Despite the fact, I would admit that despite the fact there is a problem of unemployment, the problem of price rise, the COVID crisis, all these things, these factors are there, but they are not going to be, as I see reading through the situations, that they are not going to pose any very serious regime security problem. But the regime do recognize the vulnerability, and therefore they are trying to, create a new kind of situations to keep their youngsters, particularly. I would just refer to you. Recently, I saw a survey coming from based by a think tank in UAE, talking about the youth response to the various economic reforms. Granting that it is based from UAE, so there can be an element of bias. I will not deny that, but still, it very clearly shows that there is a huge, concern of the youngsters in the region, basically to have some kind of a, stability, peace, security, and therefore they would like that the governance becomes much more important for them. So I would like that they are not very keen. As I read it, they are not very keen to make a political bargain if the economic bargain and, more important, the social bargain can meet their requirement.
Hello, Dr. Pradhan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. There's a question for you.
Yeah.
What role you see for the whole GCC country in Afghanistan? Like Qatar has been at the forefront to invite Taliban and to be a good host, and I think they were quite active. So do you think Qatar can involve other GCC countries and to pose a united front and come up with a collective formula to resolve the Afghanistan political crisis? Thank you.
At present, it doesn't.
One of my colleagues at ICWA.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. But I would say that at present, it doesn't look like the GCC countries are coming up as a collective to have their say in Afghanistan. They have differences among them as well, so far as Afghanistan is concerned. Qatar is deeply involved in Afghanistan, as it is well known. This has, the Afghanistan crisis has put up challenges to bigger players like Saudi Arabia and UAE, who previously recognized the Taliban government. But the things have changed in over these 2 decades. So Qatar is obviously the important player, and Saudi Arabia and UAE are at present on a wait-and-watch mode, I believe. So they are in the statements, they are preaching moderation for a peaceful transition of power, whatever. But so far as GCC as an official bloc have also taken a position. But I don't think there is going to be any concerted effort on the part of GCC so far as Afghanistan issue is concerned. I think they will have to deal with them individually. Qatar is doing it its own way. So far as Saudi Arabia and UAE will have to also go their way individually so far as Afghanistan issue is concerned.
It's not every day that we have Professor Pant, who's a great expert on West Asian studies, to ask, to benefit. So I'll just quickly ask a question from Professor Pant. You mentioned about the changing, if I got it right, the changing faces of political Islam, and how the challenge is actually going to be from more militant or so to say the terrorist interpretations of Islam, while the Wahhabi Islam and Muslim Brotherhood, which have been in contest, may actually de-escalate, if I got it right. So basically, if you could just elaborate this point about the changing role of political Islam in the conflict in the region. Sir.
You see, political Islam became a part of the international political lexicon only with the Wahhabis, coming in a very big way and promoting across after the Islamic Revolution, when the tension took place between Iran and Saudi Arabia. After that, it has its own. We are not talking about Islam as a religion. We are talking as a political Islam. Now, as it graduated over a period of time, we found that the people started drawing line on the basis of that. The way the Wahhabis started there defining the Islam, it was a relatively more militant compared to the earlier, or militant, I should say, much more extremist in its nature. But with the coming of the ISICC, the entire project of the definition of the ISI has rejected the entire Saudi, definition of Wahhabi Islam. They said that it is not the true Wahhabi Islam, but they started defining the Wahhabi Islam. So my argument is that the kind of definition we could define as a political Islam, which was more a homogeneous category of the kind, and countries could own that this is my way of understanding of Wahhabi Islam or thought, or the Muslim Brotherhood kind of thing. Now, this project I think has lost its meaning largely because of the Arab uprising, which Arab uprising has, after that Arab uprising, you have Muslim Brotherhood coming to the power in two, 3 countries. And in a manner of speaking, they failed. And still there is the same demand for which that they came to power. The demand are coming in the Tunisia and in Cairo and everywhere, you see. So the kind of a role which the political Islam played or provided the dividend to the state to use it, Muslim Brotherhood as a political Islam, that is also not seems to be there. You see, it is in this context, if the present rulers they can't say that we are against Islam, because they are Islamic countries, no doubt about it. But how are they going to define my Islam? And that is where you see the UAE now defining tolerance as one of the concept of its own Islam. And as mentioned by the ambassador, that mosque, synagogue or temple, everything is there. Let's say the Islam is tolerant Islam kind of. The Saudi Crown Prince has said that moderate Islam. He gives our own definition of moderate Islam. So therefore, what I'm trying to say, that given the fact that the Islam has failed to provide them the kind of security which it provided at one point of time, is not going to come to their rescue now in the coming year as the governance is concerned. They will have to, it will be one of the tools, but they cannot say that they can run or govern their country or keep their people engaged on the basis of their understanding of they have been. The people not going to be carried away by that kind of Islam. In fact, I will go to the extent of saying that given a possibility, even the Iranian would like to redefine the Islam. If the system of elections are relatively fair in there, you see. If you recall the kind of debate which was going on before the elections in Iran, what basically is, people are talking against Islamic revolution, not in the religious sense but in the political sense. They found that Islamic revolution failed to deliver the kind of expectations, the kind of dreams, or the kind of possibilities were there, and therefore they are not interested in accepting it. It's a different system. It is different that the electoral politics did not allow that expressions to come to mainstream. That's a different thing. The point trying to say as a student of this region, that these instrument of legitimizing power are losing their relevance over a period of time. With some instrument, you can govern up to a point of time. If you fail to deliver, you can't deploy the same political Islam for governance and for legitimacy again and again. You see, so you have no choice but to redefine, reinvent your Islam. So therefore, it is in this sense I see that you will find that countries will be, rather than a school of thought of Islam in a political sense, they would like to have defined their own way to justify. But beyond that, they know that it will not deliver. Again, if you read that youth survey, there again the response of the youth, especially one report came from Economic and Social Commission West Asia also. They also made a survey of the youngsters' changing opinion. And it very clearly reflect that they don't say no to religion, but their yes to religion is qualified. So that's how I see that the potential of this as a political instrument of governance or legitimacy is not likely to be there as strong as it was used earlier.
There's another question from Dr. Sanjay Kumar for you, sir. He says, during your conversation, you talked about techno-economic complementarity between India, US, UAE, Israel. Do you see any kind of political framework emerging out of this engagement? You talked about techno-economic complementarity between India, UAE, Israel, and United States. Do you see any kind of political framework emerging out of this engagement?
The fact that the four countries are talking in terms of some project, leave aside for the time being, let's say Project X. Now, if they're talking of Project X, there has to be some understanding within the four partners, that we understand on certain issues, we have a common understanding, and therefore we will go for Project X. Now, entire project of regionalization of any region, forget about the particular region, I'm talking of the European Common Market days. It was essentially, it was a political understanding which led to the economic formation. So I would not like to argue that there is a political understanding for that, you see. But I will certainly like to say that there is some common understanding of sorts, that which gives them the kind of possibility to explore the complementarities. And mind you, when I'm talking of the complementarities, these complementarities are going to again give you political dividend to all the four players in their respective constituencies. Because if this project becomes successful, it can have a cost part of it. I'm not talking about, but for instance, Israelis need a technology market. India is looking for technology, and we don't have finances. I mean, for one example, which I can give you very easily, is the entire green technology development. You see, now Saudis, UAE, India, USA, if they come together, it can be very a very powerful instrument to bring certain kind of changes in the technology as far as the green technology is concerned. Now, to arrive at that, you need to have understanding. I mean, whether you call it a political understanding or not, I'm not saying that it will lead to, and it is possible that as these results, as this kind of a understanding becomes a kind of project which is successful dividend, it can lead to some kind of a new political understanding. That is possible, but we cannot argue that today the political understanding of the kind we talk about in international relations, that there can be security architecture, etc. I think it will be premature to talk about it. And as India would not like to be projected that way, because India has the other part of the, of its territory as the Southeast Asia and a part of it. So you can't ignore the implication for that. So it is not going to be a security-based project in terms of public consumption, but there has to be some understanding that technology by itself is a security provider. You see, if there is technological arrangement that the technology is being made available to you, you are giving me technology, but in the process, in the bargain, you are giving me the security. So you cannot deny that. But the point is, the short point is that it is not that kind of political understanding of group formation, alliances of that kind. Those possibilities I'm not arguing, but there is certainly some kind of understanding of a broad, framework which facilitate the technological transition, which in terms mean security provider.
Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of the program. It's already 5 o'clock. Now it's time to thank all of you. I think we have a very insightful discussion today. On behalf of ICWA, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to all our panelists. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Director General ICWA, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, the Deputy Director General, Mr. Suman Bagchi, and the Director Research, Dr. Nivedita Ray, for their valuable inputs and guidance. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.